In the noisy universe of modern gurus, promises of quick money and absolute freedom are sold with designer suits and sharp words. There are figures who rise with a mix of admiration and rejection. Dan Lok became one of those figures, a man who presents himself as the king of high-ticket sales. Author of bestsellers, host of a podcast interviewing magnates, and creator of programs that promise to teach others to charge fees that once seemed unreachable. His platforms and his message have reached millions. His own narrative, that of an immigrant who went from ruin to amassing multi-million-dollar sales, has been repeated on his website, on his channel, and in interviews until it became his personal legend. That public construction, on one hand, gave him influence, an audience, and products with which to generate large-scale revenue. On the other hand, the same visibility lit up the flashlights off those who began to scrutinize his biography, his numbers, and his promises, because becoming rich is not an act, is a habit, just as being poor is not an act either. It's not something that simply happens to you. It's just a habit. Most people listen to a webinar, watch a video, and think, oh, this man is making a lot of money online, I could do that. They throw themselves into it, try it for 3 months, and then think, this doesn't work. His origins form an essential part of his discourse. Born in Hong Kong, moved to Canada during his teenage years, a childhood he himself described as traumatic, where he went from some degree of comforto, living in hardship, with his mother. That story works as the first act off the drama of overcoming debt and reinvention. Those years are recounted on his own website, repeated in profiles and reports that reconstruct how, after repeated business failures and debt he himself admitted to, he wove the narrative that he would later monetize. That early stage not only explains his emotional speech, if I could, you can too, but also legitimizes, in the eyes of many, his offer, that of someone who learned to sell and now teaches others how to close high-ticket deals. However, when his personal story was put against public documentation, business records, companies' properties, the first cracks began to appear. Pointed out by amateur investigatorist critics alike, the core of his empire's value proposition revolves around one concept: high-ticket closing high-value sales and teaching others how to do it. Programs like the famous high-ticket closer, certifications, masterminds, platforms connecting closers with businesses, and a battery of complementary courses and products formed the skeleton of his business and official communications. There are numbers, promises of professional transformation in 90 days, success stories of graduates, and a language of exclusive that turns the buyer into a member of a select tribe. In practice, this translated into marketing funnels that began with free or low-cost seminars, continued with mid-priced courses, and for those who passed, access was offered to much more expensive programs: CONSULTANCIES, inner circles, and one-to-one packages that multiplied the initial investment. That product ladder is efficient for those who master persuasion. It generates recurring income, reinforces the idea of stepped progress, and keeps much of the audience constantly chasing the next level, the one supposedly containing the ultimate secret. But it wasn't. Long before voices appear describing the machinery behind the tale, criticism centered on upselling practices, offering ever more expensive levels, testimonials from dissatisfied students, analyses showing that much of the content was recycled. Motivation or teachings is lie found in cheaper or free sources. Independent investigators, bloggers, and YouTube content creators being and documenting cases of students claiming they hadn't achieved the promised results test, paying thousands of dollars, denounced aggressive marketing strategies, artificial scarcity, time pressure, lack of transparency and verifiable results, all pushing impulsive decisions at the same time. Reports and public discussions arose about the way wealth was displayed. Cars, watches, mansions, and travels, proof of success, but which critics investigated, sometimes finding them to be rentals, temporary possessions, or stage setups for promotional material. In some, what for many was inspiration began to look. For others, like a stage set, serving sales, the tension between his narrative and criticism grew. In the age of video investigations, channels dedicated to exposing Guruspoot, his courses, and success stories under the microscope. Interviews with former students and ADD analysts reached massive audience. ASINs reignited the debate. Are we looking at a mentor with a valuable method, or a seller of hope packaged as a product? For his defenders, criticism was a reflection of envy of those who never invested in themselves. For his detractors, the heavy reliance on sales techniques, the repetition of unverifiable testimonials, and the commercial architecture of his business formed a system that, while not necessarily illegal, was highly profitable at the cost of human expectations. Business media portrayed him with mixed tones, profiles praising his resilience, but also notes acknowledging controversy. Thus he became both a media success and a figure of suspicion. That ambiguity is the raw material of this story. A character built with the classic ingredients of the guru, a tough origin, inspiring speeches, a supposedly replicable formula, and a commercial machinery that exploits scarcity, psychology, social proof, and the promise of a shortcut to exceptional income. Between the official narrative and public accusations, practical, verifiable questions, which registered companies support the revenue figures he promotes. What documented evidence exists of the supposed success cases? To what extent are the techniques original, or simply collections of public knowledge? Those questions multiplied in blogs, forums, and reports. Pushing the discussion from reputation verification, it was no longer enough to believe the story it had to be. Proven with the media push Dan Lok had forged, the next step was consolidating his sales empire through upselling. TechniQuest placed him at the center of growing controversy. His flagship program, High Ticket Closer, was priced around $2,500, but quickly upgrades emerged, adding another $2,000 to complete the training. In practice, many found themselves investing more than $4,500 without having closed a single deal to recover. Even part of that investment, that ladder of programs, led to an even more selective level high-ticket millionaire, supposedly designed so graduates could lead others in share commissions. The problem was, many of those students hadn't even closed their first sale. On specialized forums, especially Reddit, this ruthless logic was quickly exposed. One user put it bluntly, "Dan Lok is a fraud, bro. Save your money," another warned. Please watch CoffeeZilla's Dan Lok testimonials, bor. You make this mistake and lose your $2,000. Testimonials from ex-students began to go viral in videos, where they shared regrets beyond financial loss. One claimed to have lost tens of thousands of dollars and to follow a formula that never materialized. The dynamic became mechanical, admission with a high fee, emotional pressure, promises of immediate wealth, and then a doorway to an even more expensive next level. Behind the curtain, suspicion grew. Dan Lok seemed less interested in creating successful closers than in keeping the revenue machine alive. Memberships, private consultations, face-to-face calls at exorbitant prices around $166 per minute. According to critics, even his book F.U. Money West, broken down by critics like Lloyd Macheto, who argued that only a few chapters had substance, while the rest promoted Lok's other products. He described him as an empty marketing figure. He charges $166 per minute, They become rich because they teach you how to become rich, and you pay them money to teach you how to become rich. Still, not everything in this story is dark or unanimous. Some bloggers admitted they found real value in his courses. One argued that although the marketing was aggressive, techniques like the hypothetical close, a specific way of handling client objections, did help him recover his investment and more. The core problem, then, was the disparity between promise and substance. Dan Lok sold a powerful narrative. The fragile immigrant who overcame $150,000 in debt at just 20 years old after 13 failed businesses, and who then, thanks to a mentor, achieved financial success that legend certainly inspired. But when faced with public records, registered companies, verifiable results, cracks emerged, quickly highlighted by testimonies and independent analysis. This contrast created a fracture in public perception. What if, far from being a role model, his real business was selling the illusion of success? What if many invested thousands silently to be left with motivational recordings, but no real income sources or client networks? Meanwhile, his followers kept receiving messages. Never give up. Wealth begins in your mind, but at the same time, a critical community dissected his model, inflated courses, vague goals, symbolic rewards, lack of transparency, and above all, a commercial strategy based on the next bigger payment. The tension was obvious. Some defended him as a legitimate sales master. Others felt manipulated by a carefully designed emotional environment. Public pressure on Dan Lok was no longer a rumor. It had become a phenomenon with real weight and consequences. Media outlets discreetly began investigating, contacting ex-students, verifying tax records. A business magazine published a report where several people said, spent between Yi-Wen-Mei-Yen and Lam-Wen on different levels of his system without closing a single stiletto, recover even a fraction of the money. Curiously, those numbers never appeared as case studies in Lok's promotional material, where success stories always shined, with round figures about multiplied investments. The gap between what was promised and what many students lived was becoming abysmal. Anonymous interviews revealed this emotional pressure during courses. One woman recounted how motivational speeches attacked her insecurities. If you can't close a deal, it's because you're not ready to be rich. That guilt drove her to take out credit or pay for a more expensive mastermind group only to find more promises. More emotional testimonials, but no clear path to a real sale. The narrative of self-improvement became an emotional trap, making it hard to question him without feeling inferior. Yet Dan still had fierce defenders on YouTube and social media. He responded to criticism as personal attacks, saying they can attack my story, but they can't deny my students are achieving results. But those claims were usually backed by emotional videos, hugs, smiles, testimonials, but very few verifiable data about real clients or revenue. Those who asked for specifics get vague answers like, it depends on your discipline, or every case is different. The gap between emotional, rhetoric, empirical evidence become the axis of public debate. Meanwhile, investigative channels like Kafiza analyzed the legal structures behind Lok's empire. They found that his registered business ested align with the millionaire income he employed in his promotional materials. They also exposed how many of the luxuries he showed, luxury cars, expensive watches, first-class trips, were more part of the show than proof of personal wealth. Some items were rentals. Others borrowed through marketing networks or collaborators. That staging put in doubt authenticity of the lifestyle. As proof of success, the pressure intensified when ex-students organized in Facebook, Telegram, and Reddit groups to share testimonies. legal templates, and strategies to recover money. Public petitions were sent to consumer protection agencies, and legal professionals began evaluating whether predatory practices were in plain realistic gain expectations, lack of clear refunds, contracts more tied to emotional commitment, and measurable results. Journalists, too, began fact-checking the $150,000 debt story. No official records were found off failed companies with that loss amount, nor debt balances matching the myth that challenged the very foundation of his success story. If the starting point of the legend was questionable, the authenticity of the entire narrative fell under suspicion. Defenders argued his story didn't need to be literal, it worked as a metaphor from scarcity to abundance. But critics responded, when a metaphor leads vulnerable people make real financial decisions, it ceases to be inspiring. It becomes dangerous. This raised an incisive question. At what point does motivational storytelling turn into an emotional product with real victims? The erosion of Dan Lok's figure was slow but steady. As with many personalities built on charisma, his influence held up for a time even as criticism grew massive, but constant accumulation of negative testimonies, journalistic analyses, and investigative videos eventually undermined his public perception. He stopped being the king of gurus and became a symbol of a broader phenomenon. Wealth sold as a product in itself, that fall from idol to suspect was accompanied by an implacable loss of credibility. Ex-student groups grew larger, sharing contracts, NDAs, sales scripts, and details that revealed repeating emotional pressure tactics applied in different cities and countries. Even independent platforms emerged to collect complaints and offer advice to recover money. Although most cases never reached court, the collective resistance set a precedent for the first time. A motivational guru's narrative is massively cross-checked with evidence from hundreds of voicewo had lived the same experience. Meanwhile, Dan Lok tried to adapt. He shifted his message from high-ticket closer as the ultimate gateway to wealth to broader topics, a mindset, leadership, personal development. He diversified his online presence, branding, consulting, digital business advising meant to reach audiences less aware of the controversies, but his digital footprint was already marked. A simple Google search brought up critical videos, negative reviews, fraud testimonies, before his own promotional content. His reputation even took hits inside the guru ecosystem. Ex-collaborators accused him of appropriating techniques, inflating results, and crossing ethical line 7. In the lax world of digital marketing, he went from admired referencetto, uncomfortable example proof of what happens in theatrics and ostentation surface, real content. Culturally, the Dan Lok case became a mirror of an era obsessed with shortcuts to prosperity. It represented fusion of self-help aesthetics, multi-level marketing logic, and fascination with visible luxury. His figure showed that you didn't need a proven history of successful business to become a guru. It was enough to tell a good story, where symbols of wealth and promise what desperate people wanted to hear. But it also showed the price of that strategy. Growing distrust toward an entire sector, where even legitimate mentors begin to be suspected of being another Dan Lok. The legacy he left is ambiguous. For some, he remains a reference in sales, someone who, despite controversy, taught useful persuasion techniques to those who applied them with discipline. For others, he is the embodiment of a modern fraud, sophisticated, emotional, never fully illegal, but leaving behind concrete victims, indebted. Disappointed, that ambiguity explains why his name still sparks intense discussions. There's no absolute consensus in whether he was a genuine teacher with ethical flaws, or a smoke seller who enriched himself at the cost of others' illusions. Today, Searching his name brings a clear result, alongside his own ads. There are articles calling him a scammer, videos dismantling his persona piece by piece, and communities citing him as an example of commercial manipulation. His story became a warning, a lesson, and a contemporary myth, and therein lies the paradox. The man who promised to teach people how to close million-dollar deal ended up, for many, being the most expensive and painful deal of their lives.